next speaker is Alex Rushforth, who will speak on the responsible use of metrics.
I think I can see it actually. Okay, hi everybody. Thank you to Zacharias and the organisers for inviting me here. Great to be here. So you've heard so far from the meta-scientist, you've heard from the scientometrician. Now it's time to hear from the sociologist. So I'm going to speak about responsible metrics, past, present and future. For the part about the past and the present, I'm going to draw on some sociological work that I've done with a colleague, Johan Hammerfeldt. And for the future part, I'm going to step back from that a bit and be a bit more normative, maybe a bit more constructive, and make some suggestions for what the future might entail. So when I refer to responsible metrics here, it's a broad umbrella term that simply refers to shared concerns about the misuses and unintended consequences of evaluative bibliometrics in research assessment contexts of various kinds. So if we start with the past, there's a question about where do we actually start this story, right? I mean, I would tend to go back to the very foundations of any kind of bibliometric tools and how they're applied. The idea that they should be applied in research evaluation contexts. So as Giovanni mentioned, concerns about the risks of evaluative bibliometrics go back as far as the very invention of the tools themselves, practically. And indeed, there's been a very rich and important tradition within the field of scientometrics. Partly it's based on a kind of technical expertise, and partly it's just the kind of feedback loops that you get from seeing how these tools are being applied out in the wild. And there's always been this kind of professional sort of standard to try and, or this professional responsibility within the field to try and improve these situations and speak out. So it's really important, I think, to acknowledge that tradition. But I think to speed things up and move slightly more to the recent past, we'll go to the 2010s. So this is when three very influential statements or interventions around this question of responsible metrics appeared. The term responsible metrics itself was kind of coined in the 2015 or 2016 Metric Tide report. But I think it captured a lot of longer standing kind of issues and considerations and tried to synthesize them. So I think perhaps what is different about the 2010s compared to previous discussions and initiatives around this question of evaluative bibliometrics and how to ensure they're used appropriately is that it becomes something more of a movement with these kinds of interventions that were published. So there's more of a kind of organized and concerted, collective set of initiatives that have some impact on policy, at least in some corners of the world. You can always kind of exaggerate these things and how far they've reached. But definitely in my bubble, this became a bit more of a concerted thing that was very visible in the 2010s. So I want to highlight the word movement is important. We've heard about the responsible assessment movement. We've heard about responsible metrics movement. So I want to take this word movement seriously. And fortunately, there is a big sociological literature about social movements. I'll put a definition on screen. And I think it's interesting and important to think about what kind of movement is or was the responsible metrics movement. So it's not a revolutionary movement, but I think it's a reform movement. It's quite a pragmatic reform movement in a sense. So it's not necessarily trying to address big structural problems within academia per se and fix them. I think it's a bit more focused upon small wins, finding kind of compromise positions and so on. Now, if any of you have come across social movements, or if you haven't, then this notion of framing is very influential and important. So a frame is, well, there's a sort of jargony definition here, contentious process whereby a movement generates and promotes shared meanings about social conditions and practices, not only that differ from existing ones, but that also try to challenge them. So a framing for collective action in a social movement often focuses upon a diagnosis. So this is an account of what has gone wrong with the social order and what is to blame or what is responsible for this. But closely tied to this as well is usually some kind of proposed solution or course of action for how to ameliorate the identified problem. Now, the thing is that we might think sometimes that there's a single frame within a social movement, but actually, if you look closely, there's usually more than one frame circulating. And even where we think there might be unity and broad agreement, there can still be different framings kind of floating around and circulating. So sometimes this doesn't particularly create a problem. People kind of think, yeah, that person has a slightly different way of putting it, but they're kind of on my side. We kind of agree enough to work together. But at other times, you can get splintering of a movement because you have different framings, different ways of diagnosing a problem or proposing solutions. And you can also get competing social movements who kind of see a similar kind of problem area, but have just very different ways of diagnosing and solving them. It's not working. So why is this all relevant? Well, I think we can see some of the conflicts that have emerged around responsible metrics as a movement over the years and how it's evolved in terms of framing and frame conflicts. So the overarching kind of policy frame initially is this quite kind of rational utopian ideal of bibliometrics as perhaps neutral tools, efficient. They are really effective and superior ways of administering evaluations. They help with selectivity, accountability. They can incentivize competition and so on and so forth. So when over the years this kind of quite hopeful framing has been implemented, it has created some unintended consequences. And I think 3 different framings under the responsible metrics umbrella exist, which have tried to address some of those unintended consequences. So firstly, we have the metric skepticism framing. So as the name suggests, this is the more skeptical of the framings. So sometimes this can be informed by a more kind of realist or positivistic tradition where you're questioning the validity or the reliability of these indicators. But generally speaking, it tends to be informed by more kind of critical and constructivist traditions within social sciences, whereby these tools of bibliometrics are conveyed as tools of power and control and ideology and so on, focuses a lot on their corrosive effects. And I think the prognosis usually there is to say we should kind of abandon them or resist them, or that they have no value, etc. So hopefully that's a kind of a recognizable ideal type there that you will kind of hear in some of these debates. Oops, sorry. Next, we have the professional expert framing. So this sees bibliometric tools not as perfect, so it does acknowledge that there are some limitations and perhaps formal biases in the tools. But this does still see the value of the tools, and it sees maybe the tools having kind of limitations as not a problem in itself, but the onus is more on the users of the tools to kind of upskill themselves and to be more aware and knowledgeable about these limitations. So this is, typically a kind of framing which you might find in the scientometrics community quite a bit, for example. So, I mean, one of the solutions then is for users of evaluative bibliometrics to pay greater attention to the expertise within scientometric communities. And this is available, through books, training courses, analytics reports, and so on and so forth. Less familiar, and I'll probably spend less time explaining this, but this was reflexivity framing. So this was primarily in the metric tide report, and drew on ideas around responsible research and innovation and science and technology studies to try and look for compromises and better communication and more reflexivity around uses of these tools in practice. Okay, so we think that all three framings occur across some of these interventions from the 2010s. And they're kind of sometimes there and don't seem to be particularly in conflict, but other times they appear to kind of create a few tensions. But there are some basic compromise positions reached in these texts, which I think have been influential. So one which reaches across both, where I think there can be broad consensus between, say, scientometrics community and the kind of wider reform initiatives, is on abandonment of the journal impact factor as advocated in the DORA declaration. But also taken forward from some of these earlier texts are the questions around around informed peer review. So this idea that bibliometrics can support, but maybe not necessarily replace expert peer judgments. And indeed, the idea that bibliometric tools should not be abandoned completely, but used responsibly. So I kind of want to now move a bit more to the present and look at what's happened to those kind of compromise positions as we've moved forwards. So I left CWTS and went and did something else in 2017. And at the time I was there was a lot of interest in the responsible metrics movement. When I returned 4 years later, a lot had changed in the landscape. It was no longer a responsible metrics movement, but it was a research assessment reform movement more generally. So a lot of new actors had kind of entered the space. There are a lot of new initiatives, a lot of new statements, hell of a lot of new statements. So one of the important things that had changed then is it was no longer really a question about, or it was no longer solely focused about responsible uses of bibliometrics, but it was a bit more of a general, widened scope, which was about how should we evaluate researchers and research institutions and funding proposals and so on. And then I think what had happened is that the responsible metrics movement had circulated, expanded, and it has crossed paths with other science reform movements. So the suggestions in these statements like Kawara that came out that said that, open science should be more recognized. Maybe EDI should be more recognized, societal impact, and so on. So some of these other science reform and social movements have kind of crossed paths with the responsible metrics movement. And so we have this kind of this mix now. But where does this leave questions of evaluative bibliometrics? So how are they being kind of treated by the current champions of evaluation reform in initiatives like Kawara and related initiatives? Well, what you see with the kind of framing as it has evolved is you often get this kind of diagnosis, which is still pretty skeptical and hostile in tone towards bibliometrics. So I'm going to repeat that statement that I saw on Gunnar's slide yesterday. So there's a kind of statements either in some of the text or in other communication outlets from some of the members of these initiatives that are very critical of bibliometrics in a kind of general sense. So they diagnose and attribute the problem that we face to bibliometrics and their kind of presence in the research system. But they don't go down the prognosis of the metric skepticism, saying that we should abandon them altogether. So it still has this kind of prognosis that says they still can play an important role if they're used responsibly, and they should support assessment where meaningful and relevant. So there is a bit of a kind of ambiguity at times, and I can sort of see why it creates confusion, because on the one hand, there's kind of a lot of critical tone around bibliometrics. But if you actually look at the statements about what should be done, then it does normally kind of align broadly with what was said in the Leiden Manifesto and the metric tide and so on. So it would seem that there is some kind of room for consensus still, and some kind of broad agreement on ideas like informed peer review and responsible uses of metrics. But Hammerfelt and I predicted at the end of our 2023 study, from which a lot of this is based, that although these kind of mantras do get repeated and there might be some kind of truce between these different framings, it is a fragile truce, partly because, you know, there are still folks that very much subscribe to a kind of metric skepticism framing, and that is not going to be well received by folks who subscribe more to a professional expert framing. So these conflicts were likely to reoccur, we predicted. And yeah, within no time, really, I think our kind of prediction was fairly vindicated. So we had a piece from within the scientometrics community about bibliometrics denialism, and then Giovanni's piece came out. That was more recent. So these lay out a number of critiques of the Quora and related initiatives. These include a tendency for perhaps either the initiatives themselves or the followers of the initiatives to perhaps indulge in a kind of blanket dismissal and ridiculing of bibliometrics. A lack of precision about some of the actual purposes and uses of bibliometrics in research, and a nostalgic romanticization of peer review. So this is, you know, a kind of frame conflict that's reappeared recently. So, you know, I have a bit of sympathy here. So I do recognize that there is this kind of tendency, particularly online and on social media, to kind of really blanketly dismiss evaluative bibliometrics, to reduce the whole of bibliometrics to the impact factor and the H-index, and to some occasions actually blame scientometricians for coming up with these, which is, you know, totally false. And likewise, I think there could have been more engagement from Quora and related initiatives with scientometrics as a field, and I think there still could be. So I think there are some kind of reasonable arguments here. But I would say, I do want to question some of the arguments advanced in these pieces. So I acknowledge the argument made by someone in the audience about the neutrality of these tools. But I'd like to particularly focus on this idea that the onus is entirely on kind of individual users, which is something which, okay, of course, the book stops with individual users, but individual users need to have a kind of institutional infrastructure around them in order to educate themselves and to be made aware of some of these kinds of limitations and risks in using evaluative bibliometric tools. I don't think we really have that kind of institutional infrastructure in place in academia at the moment. Maybe some corners you have it, but it's not really mainstream. Thanks. So what would the kind of more collective sectoral approach to responsibility look like? And what do we need to do to get there? Well, I would say that given the expanded scope of this reform movement, responsible metrics isn't really at the focus of it anymore. So I think some of the momentum that I had noticed had been raised around the Leiden Manifesto and other initiatives has now really been lost a bit. So, you can mention something like informed peer review mantra in passing in some of these texts, but it's not really front and center. So I would argue that perhaps amongst Quora and related initiatives, this issue could reappear once again and become more of a kind of strategic priority. I think, though, we also need to be working towards upskilling and building awareness of the uses, but also limitations of bibliometric tools across university sectors, funders, and so on. For this, you need investment. So we can't really rely something like Dora, Leiden Manifesto, Quora, whatever. They'd only be able to take these things so far at present. There's only so far signing of agreements can take you. You actually need money spending on providing kind of educational resources, providing training opportunities. You need universities and funders to engage with this and perhaps make it mandatory to attend such courses. And likewise, I think the field of scientometrics, it's pretty weakly institutionalized. So I don't really think at the moment there's not that many people in the field and they're quite spread out. So there isn't really a capacity to meet the consulting needs that would be needed to try and transmit a lot of this expertise. So you'd really need more priority investment in the field of scientometrics. And, eventually you'd need things like undergraduate programs, a master's program, PhD program, and so on. So it is weakly institutionalized at the moment, and people are kind of drawn from all kinds of other disciplines. So this kind of field and its expertise would really need to be scaled up, I think, to meet the kind of scale of the task and the problem. I think this, of course, then requires like lobbying and campaigning. And I think this is somewhere where Quora could perhaps play a role. It already has this kind of significant platform for learning. It has visibility. It has skilled campaigners. It has momentum. So I think Quora could really play a role there in trying to kind of really boost the institutional support for responsible metrics training and knowledge production. I think as well, Quora could begin to counsel some of its followers more and push back more on some of the more crude bibliometric bashing to make progress here. And I do notice the blog that came out yesterday, which I think was, a really good intervention in this respect. But ultimately, for all of this to happen, to get started, you do need some kind of rapprochement between scientometrics community and Quora and related initiatives. So that is my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we're going to take questions, but let me chip in that for a second. I wanted to say that before after the lunch presentation as well. Just emphasizing your last point about putting together the scientometric community and Quora, that maybe it has been just a non-conscious omission. So Quora is a movement. So in some sense, it didn't have some kind of a coordinating mind behind this, but it's an open movement. So I understand, as Elizabeth said, that it's always the option of trained scientometricians to join. And actually, this conference is part of this endeavor. That was one of the objectives, to bring together the two communities. And as Elizabeth said, I've also joined one of the working groups of Quora. So it's open, and there's no reason why the scientometric community does not play an important role. So questions, please. It seems that, yes, Elizabeth.
much on it. Thanks, Alex. I think that was a really great kind of balanced piece that we needed in this conversation. So thank you for that, and thank you for all your work in this space. But can I just ask you a question around your comment that scientometrics needs to be better institutionalised in universities? By that, you mean kind of better training or development of staff that have scientometric expertise and perhaps broader research assessment expertise, kind of working, and the professionalisation, I suppose, of scientometrics. Is that what you're talking to?
Yeah, I think a lot of the bigger centres in scientometrics, they do kind of basic fundamental research, but they also do contract research, consultancy, policy interventions, and so on. So I don't want to sort of blow the trumpet of CWTS, but that is a model of how you can do it. But there aren't very many of these institutions around, and a lot of the leading figures are maybe in the field can be lone wolves, or they can be in kind of other faculties, and it don't really have their own kind of department or educational, like undergraduate courses and all of that kind of thing. So the courses that do exist are often professional training courses, which are really important, but there could be this kind of layer of training before that, I think. And I would envisage such an expanded field working both on on all kinds of basic research, but also kind of meeting the needs for consultancy, expert reports, and so on. So at the moment, I don't really think there's enough capacity for that.
Yes, a little bit more comment. I mean, I think it's a nice balanced approach, and I think we should not evolve into like a conflict between choir and the same politicians. I mean, I think there's a common enemy quotation marks, which is a people who are used to the metrics, and which is what I think what John Ioannidis was also talking about. I think that I think we should be on the same side. I'm not happy to either of these kind of neutral, but I think all of us here should be on the same side of the issue. And the problem is those people or organizations that approve the rankings that we should be the sort of metrics that we should be taking aim at, not each other. But I was going to ask one question, which I'm going to sorry, I'm going to go back to another of Giovanni's analogies. So we already talked about the vaccine analogy, but so Giovanni likened the scientistician to the physician that we go to and we refer to them because they're experts. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, I think I wondered about that. So I read about this in the paper. So you compared, for example, the scientist to the surgeon that uses robotic kind of tools. But I wonder, though, is the scientist not more like the kind of medical engineer who designs the machine? So they're not necessarily applying the tools in this context of application, but they're more, designing the kind of technical infrastructure that's getting applied. And then, of course, they also have expertise because they speak to people the surgeons who apply the tools, and they get feedback and so on. So yeah, I thought that was maybe a better analogy for the work of scientometricians and how they relate to context of practice than the robotic surgeon per se.
But there are also evaluative scientometricians who apply their research to conduct research assessment exercises
in their own field.
Yes.
Yeah, that's fair.
So, wow.
Okay, yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah. So I think neither of these analogies works then in that case. No, they're not quite right. Right, okay, got you.
Yes, I experienced this this conference as a meeting place that you have created. And it's a very positive thing. And I like the discussions so far. But when looking back at the phase where Quara invited sketches for working groups, I myself, together with 2-3 other institutions, where we work on exactly these problems, we made a sketch for how to go forward on the idea of combining peer review with proper bibliometric methods, which is there in the agreement. And there was no response at all from Quora to our suggested solution for a working group working on this. And then finally it ended up with one working group for responsible metrics, where I couldn't recognize anyone from our field in the group. And it is led not by an expert in the field, but an expert in psychometrics, psychological metrics. So I have been wondering all the time what happened and how are people selected and how are working groups selected in Quora. I got the impression that at that time, I don't have it any longer, because there's been much communication aside from this. But I got the impression this time that Quora was afraid of taking on board our expertise and institutions where we have worked on these problems.
Maybe the people who can be able to answer this later.
So I like the idea of describing it as a movement, and a movement has to learn as it goes. And we are already into this learning phase, I think.
I think
I can respond to that, because I was in the meeting when those working groups were considered. And no working group, we had a fantastic range of applications, and they were considered across the criteria that was made transparently available. And no working group was outright turned down. So I don't know what happened there, going to whether there should have been some communication to you to invite you to participate in the grouping of interested working groups on the responsible metrics. That should have happened. If it didn't happen, perhaps it went to somebody else, not directly to you, but that was the outcome of that conversation, because there were, we didn't, there was so much, these are voluntary groups, we were not going to turn down expert volunteers to work on really important areas. So I didn't follow on the outcome that. There's a lot of working groups, obviously, but that should have happened, and there is still obviously opportunity for any member of Quora to participate in any working group. So if you feel as though the expertise that's needed is not on that group, I would urge you to join that group. We would very much welcome your input. Quora is a coalition of its members. It's not anyone kind of setting themselves up as experts and us deferring to that. We must all kind of work together to develop the solutions that we think are needed. So I would definitely urge you to participate in that. I can talk to you later anyway. But yeah.
Yeah,
that's what
I think there probably needs to be an alternative mechanism though within the working groups to try and embed and transmit some of the research expertise into Quora, because I think the working groups, we did try and put one together for something else, and it didn't get accepted. So the feedback we got was, we kind of want something that's more kind of focused around implementation than research. Kind of sounded to me like it was exclusively kind of implementation based. And I joined for some time another working group, but again, they weren't really interested in research per se, the members. So I just felt like I didn't have much to contribute to that really, that was of added value. So I just don't really think they are a good channel for transmitting expertise. So I think some kind of alternative structure might need to be thought up and introduced.
Thank you. My concern is to try to understand the set of incentives that each Quora or the bibliographic approach generates. One concern, especially with the metrics approach, is that it emphasizes quantity over quality. And then people will just engage in fast projects to generate more research without any depth and quality, which will have a longer impact in the society. So that's my concern. So we need to look into the incentives each strategy generates and try to find the best approach.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's important. I mean, going back to the slide that Gunnar had yesterday about the different applications of bibliometrics in different evaluation contexts, it looks very different. So a bit of precision about strengths and drawbacks of evaluative bibliometrics and peer reviews at different levels of assessment is really important as well, I think.
Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation, and I really enjoyed the paper as well. So my question is, it's not a question actually, it's very light. It's just, I was wondering, do you think that there is an external driver to this movement, and whether that could show us in a way where this will go? Because what do you think? What we go from responsible metrics to the responsible research assessment movement, and now where is this going? What is driving this change? Because I'm thinking there shouldn't be a conflict between parent data scientometrics, but in case there is, I think that there's anyway something inherent that is driving this whole movement. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
I wouldn't say it's one particular thing. I tend to think of it as more unplanned and emergent. So you get, say, a concern around, evaluative bibliometrics that bubbles up into a movement over time. That then meets with other movements that happen to be going on, reform movements. They kind of meet each other, they collide, new things get worked out, and we move on. We do, the movement changes. Maybe it becomes one movement. So I don't think there's a kind of central drive. I mean, there are big structural things in play with all of this, like managerialism in the professions, competition, budget cuts, how do we manage our scarce resources, all of those kind of things. So there's that kind of institutional, structural set of factors that are behind all of this. But yeah, I don't know if there's like one thing driving it per se.
So just before we go to the last presentation and see how this whole movement concerned the country that we are now, Cyprus, let me just make a very fast comment related to the points that Alex has made, and some of the issues raised by Giovanni, especially in his paper, but also in his talk, about which is the expertise. So let's go in practice. When there is a committee and wants to hire a new person, say, what is exactly the expertise that they're supposed to have in scientometrics? I think Giovanni was suggesting that they could be able to consult the scientometrician. That doesn't seem to be very easy for me. So there are so many decisions and so many departments that this is not possible. But then going back into training in scientometrics, maybe a suggestion would be that at least in a team of researchers that include some methodologists, as they say in medical sciences, or statisticians, or people rigorously trained, maybe some of the people there who understand statistics well could take a little bit of the burden to train themselves, and kind of play a little bit of a more active role in committees and so on and so forth. Maybe this is a little bit more feasible than training everybody in scientometrics or consulting a scientometrician whenever there is a decision to be made. But without further ado, let's go to Marius Dimitriadis, who will speak about the implications of the Quara movement to Cyprus. Marius is the person that has brought everything together, the person who has masterminded and hugely helped in the SInnoPSis and TWIN4MERIT grants. So we thank him for that.